right, welcome to the Banking with Life podcast. I'm your host, James Neathery, and I'm as happy as I can be, just very proud to have my friend Dr. Paul Cleveland on today. And Dr. Paul Cleveland is a PhD economist out of Birmingham Southern, and you're currently, what do you call that? And this is where probably too much post-production needs to be made. You're a professor and a fellow at Birmingham Southern?
Well, yeah, I guess I wear several different hats. I'm a professor at Birmingham Southern, and this is my 30th year at the college. I'm teaching primarily finance at this point. But then I'm also work as a senior research fellow with the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics. They're located up just outside of D.C. in McLean, Virginia. I work with the Apologetics Resource Center here in Birmingham and do some work for them. And then I also have done, affiliated work with other organizations as well.
A prolific author and speaker, very good author, very good speaker. I mean, you're just an all-around great guy, and I would
I give it my best.
Well, good job, sir. I think we met through the Nelson Nash, right? You have, I don't know, how long did you know Nelson before he passed?
I first met Nelson in November of 1991.
Wow.
And we became friends virtually right away. I'll tell you the truth, James, the longer it's been since I've seen him, the more I miss him. And I mean, we would go to lunch periodically, and it's just, not being able to just call and go over and visit with him. I do miss those times.
Yeah, I understand that. I miss him terribly. Like you said, as the time goes on, I miss him more. Just the ability to fire off a phone call and have a 15, 20-minute conversation with him on a regular basis. But that's how we met, through Nelson Nash and the think tanks that he held prior to the formation of the Nelson Nash Institute, which I believe that occurred in 2013. And I think the first book that I read of yours was Unmasking the Sacred Lies.
Right. That was a good book. It's actually my second book. But I wrote it kind of for a broad audience, and I had a dual interest in that book. One, it was intended for a broad audience, but it was also kind of the skeletal structure for a course that I was teaching at Birmingham Southern on public choice. And so really for the students, they read the book, they would read each chapter, but then they would also read all the articles that were the references. And so that we dug into the issue of public choice, and really the book itself is his economic history of public policy in America, or as I would like to say, how did we get into this mess?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I love the cover, Belshazzar, the handwriting on the wall.
The handwriting on the wall. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, you would think people would get this. We're $22 trillion in debt. It continues to climb every year. Government's blown way out of proportion, out of control. They cannot make good on the promises that they paid. And, at some point, they got to give it up.
What do you think that would look like when they give it up?
Well, that's a good question. I'm really not even sure. What it would look like is beginning to fess up to realities of the marketplace. And that is beginning to cut back on programs and cut back on spending. I mean, until they get spending under control and begin to seriously address it and begin to cut back, there's not really a solution. Taxation at some point is not going to bring in more revenues. It's going to destroy the economy. and you can't just continue to go into debt. But at this point, that looks like that's been their choice.
Their game plan. I don't I don't believe they have the ability to fess up. I mean,
well, it doesn't look like. I just on my social media account, I posted a meme of that great American philosopher Alfred E. Newman, and he of Mad Magazine, and he said that the only time a politician is telling the truth when he's calling other politicians liars.
That's pretty. That's accurate.
Yeah, it's pretty accurate.
That's very accurate. And then, too, did you write the Understanding the Modern Culture Wars? Was that your first book?
That was it. Yeah, that was my first book. And Nelson introduced me to another. Nelson was my mentor, but another mentor in my life was a scholar, Clarence Carson. And Clarence was a historian by training, and he was out to produce, really, I think, history and social science for high schoolers. American history was his main area of interest as a historian, and he produced a 6-volume American history set. In the 1980s, he had written an economics text, and then his really the last text he wrote in this series was Basic American Government, and I was actually on his board when that book was published. There was one other one that he hadn't gotten to, and that was Western Civilization. Well, he got me to do it. So, well, here it was kind of strange. Here I am, the Economist, getting into this, but it was a great project for me because I learned so much about history, and world history, in the process of writing that book. And he said right from the start that what we're trying to do here is not just a complete, really thorough Western civilization text, but we're going to paint with broad brushstrokes, as he did in many of his books. But we're trying to get across the main themes of history and social science, the main principles that people really need to know. So, in my little book business now, for whatever reason, all these books have fallen to me, and my goal is to keep them alive for the public, for homeschoolers as well as Christian schools, or even in private schools in general. These are really solid texts.
I think that's a blessing. That's the reason you're able and capable of keeping that. So he also, and I think that I have seen one video, I think on YouTube, of Clarence Carson. But he also wrote The World in the Grip of an Idea, didn't he?
Yes, he did. And this was a book that he published back in the 1970s, so a long time ago. And anyway, how Nelson was a voracious reader.
Yes.
And Nelson was laying on his couch, and I guess he was having some back pain one day, and he wanted something to read, and he saw this book on the shelf, and he'd read it, before. And so he got Mary, his wife, in to get that book down for him so he could read it again. And he had come to me and he said, Paul, we must publish this book.
Yeah.
Well, it was a great scholarly book. I mean, it was just chock full of really good ideas and understanding of the situation of political economy in the world. And the problem was it was 500 pages and it was academic. I mean, I had read the book many years ago, and so when Nelson had come to me with that, I was like, well, let me read it. And as I read through it, I was like, oh, this is good. It's really good. But at the same time, there's not really a market for it. Nobody today is going to go out and read a 500-page book. So I thought about it for a while, and I went to Clarence's daughters, Evelyn and Melissa, and I said, would y'all mind if I tried to work with what he did? And I enlisted a friend of mine who we went to grad school together, Dwayne Barney. And we just got together and we read through it and we said, what can we do with this? And we turned it into, we pulled out of that, redid many parts of it, and we put together a book and we called it The Great Utopian Delusion, The Global Rise of Government and the Destruction of Liberty. And so I think if, we're trying to aim for a popular audience and bring his material down to the level that anyone could read and learn from, especially in an age where young people, millennials especially, are talking about how much they like socialism. And they've never lived in a socialist economy, and they don't know what it looks like. And if they really found out, they would run from it as quickly as they possibly could.
All right. I remember Nelson he was very giddy whenever you did when you wrote and published The Great Utopian Delusion. I remember that. And I think you hit a home run. It's not 500 pages, maybe a little over 100 pages.
Yes, just over 100.
Yeah, and everybody should read that book, and I think everybody should read Unmasking the Sacred Lies as well, because they're easy reads. They're not over academic. It doesn't seem like it's written solidly. I mean, you're an academician, don't misunderstand me, but yeah. These books anyone can read. And
well, that was really our aim, James, is to make it really accessible to just anybody could pick up and read the book and gain from it. So that was our goal.
Yeah, well, I think you hit a home run there, sir. And now you're doing a lot of work in the private school, the homeschooling area, right?
Well, that's right. I mean, that's what we've been up to lately is, we've got all of Clarence's work and we still have mine, of course. And so we just updated the basic economics. We had done an update, I don't know, about 10 years ago. And then people really liked it, what we did. But the one thing that we got back was that it was at too high a level for the average student. I mean, you pretty much had to be to go at it at your own pace and be able to dig through it pretty much on your own. And so we decided, okay, well, let's try to make this more accessible to the average high school student. And so that was our goal. I enlisted my son, who's now actually teaching high school economics, and he read through the third edition that we had, and he would come into me and he goes, "Dad, I'm reading this sentence. What do you mean here?" And I would tell him. He said, "Well, why don't you just say that?" And so anyway, working with him, I mean, we really went through that book and tried to update it, tried to make it really user-friendly, so now it's textbook-like. We have study guides at the end of each chapter that have identification terms, all those sorts of things. So now all those terms are defined in the margins, like most textbooks do. And then we have pull-outs and other sorts of things with the main point that we're driving at in the chapter. And then not only that, but we also have developed an online class that pairs with the book. Mm-hmm. So if a homeschool family wanted to use the text and then purchase the class, and we have a package deal on that, so you can actually get through economics in one semester by doing that. So I think we've priced it very competitively, and We think we've got a good product for homeschoolers, and it's not going to be the kind of socialism that might be taught as economics in the public schools. And we've worked on that. We now have a online course to go with the government. We've not yet updated the government book, and we're in the process of trying to take the 6-volume history set and work with it and update it and put it in that kind of form as well.
When was that Basic Economics, the 3rd edition? Is that what you said?
Yeah, the 3rd edition. What had happened was Clarence passed away in 2003, and in the 1990s, I had done the study guide for the book, and it had been added to it, and it was in paperback form. And so then I went to, after Clarence passed away and his wife passed away, I thought, this book, I like the content, but it's really out of date. I mean, if you read through the book, because it was written in the 80s, he wrote it from the perspective that the Soviet Union still exists. And it did when he wrote the book. So there are a lot of things in it that needed to be updated if the book was going to, continue to be useful. And so once again, Evelyn and Melissa agreed, and so they turned that over to me as a project. And so I spent a lot of time, updating everything, rewriting, some things, and we put it out as a 3rd edition at that point. And so that was our process.
Was that in 2003 or 4?
I think that was like 2008 or 9. Okay. And it might have been that the publication date on the 3rd edition could have been as late as 2010. I'd have to go look.
Right. I think those are the copies that I had, is the 3rd edition.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah.
And that's, that really should be required reading, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to learn economics, because most economics today, one of the things I like about it is we're coming at this from a natural law perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Modern mainstream economics is written from its undergirding moral philosophies, utilitarianism, that was the point of view of Jeremy Bentham, and popularized really mainly by his most famous student, John Stuart Mill. And Mill produced the most widely used economics textbook in the late 19th century. So it had a huge impact upon economics. And he was this utilitarian. In other words, utilitarianism is that public policy should be based on a hedonistic calculus. That is, any particular law or program, if it adds more to happiness than it causes pain, then we should do it. So, in other words, are we making people happy? But my thing was with that, I kind of reject that, because how do you measure it? Bentham now had a term. He said, well, the unit of measure is a util. Well, I ask people all the time, how much is a util? And nobody can tell me. I can't tell you. Now, things that are measurable, we have some sense of it, like volume. And there may be different measures of volume, but, like a liter as opposed to a gallon or those sorts of things. But we can create units of measure for volume and things like that, distance and such things. But, happiness or that sort of thing, there's no measurement. And so, but that's where the political class is today. They're telling us, they're all doing these cost-benefit studies for public policy issues, and we're taking polls So we're going to stick our fingers in the air and see which way the wind blows. I mean, and I tell people all the time, I said, Bill Clinton, when he occupied the Oval Office, he told us that he could feel our pain. And I tell people all the time that, well, Bill felt all sorts of things when he was in that Oval Office.
His utils were off the charts.
But our pain wasn't one of them. So, anyway, it's craziness. It's just nonsense that to kind of go down that path. But most people have defaulted to that mindset today, and many times without even realizing it, without even realizing the implications of making those sorts of statements. So, anyway, we've abandoned that approach for natural law, which is the old school, that every person should have their life, liberty, and property protected, and that's the function of government. It's not to make everybody happy.
Right. So expand on natural law, when it comes to economics. Right.
Okay. Well, the whole idea of natural law is that, I mean, you can come at it from a secular point of view, or you can come at it from a Christian point of view. And the Christian point of view is simple, that God has created a moral order. And it's encapsulated in terms of our personal interactions. It's encapsulated in the Ten Commandments, and mainly the second half of the Ten Commandments. Honor your father and mother puts an emphasis on, due respect for proper authority structures, right? I mean, that's really behind it. Don't lie, don't steal, don't murder, don't commit adultery. Those are all things like personal interactions with one another. And then of course, the last one about coveting, well, there's the source of it all. When we begin to covet each other's positions or their property or whatever else, then that's what causes societies to break down and to fall apart. At the limit, all socialism is just it's a political economy of systematic theft, which is why they always collapse. That they cannot work for that reason, because the thief has to rely upon logical fallacy that what's good for the thief is good for everybody. And of course, it's not. It's just good for the thief. You're a pain in the rear to everybody else. And so when everybody tries to become a thief and use government to live off the production of other people, then we quit producing things. We go stand in the government line for the handout, but there's nothing to receive at the end of the day. In other words, you finally get to the end of the line to get your handout, and there's nothing to hand out. Well, and
yep. We're halfway there.
Yeah, we're moving in that direction. So
that's interesting. The systematic method of theft. What'd you say? How'd you phrase that?
Well, I just say it was a political economy that's based upon a systematic theft. Yep. It's kind of the way I phrased it.
I think we may be more than halfway there.
Well, I don't know if we're quite there. I think I think numbers right now, at least measurable numbers, that on average, about a third of everyone's property is being stolen every year by the government. Now, we still need government, so it's maybe not quite a third because that's the total. But we don't need government doing a whole lot of things that government is doing, because a lot of what government does is just taking from one person to try to give a benefit to some other person. Sure. And it's usually, and while most people think, well, we're these are welfare programs. No, not so much. I mean, the welfare is actually mainly going to corporations who could actually be on their own and produce viable products in the marketplace. And so if you look at a company, I can distinguish between what they do well as a private company, and then what they're receiving just because government has chosen to subsidize.
Well, I don't want to put you on the spot or anything, but how much government do we need?
I would say a lot less than we have now. As it started out, really for the first more than 100 years, if you added up all governmental expenditures, both federal, state, and local expenditures, it was less than 10% of GDP. And for the federal government, it's actually less than 2%. That most government was state and local, which it should be, right? I mean, if you think about the purpose of government is to provide equal protection for each individual's life, his liberty, and his property. Well, most of that's done at the local level, right? In other words, it's the local police department that goes after murderers, rapists, and thieves. And that's really the way it should be. Now, there can be situations where in a broader scale, you need the federal government. Most of the federal government, though, activity is to provide for the national defense. On this one, I would say I'm not quite sure that entails having an army that traipses around the world and tries to fight everybody else's fight. I'm not sure that's a good idea at all.
Right. There's an absolute difference between defense and offense.
Right.
The Department of War prior to World War II, and now the Department of Defense. Yeah.
So we've kind of veered off course, is my estimation, in many different ways. And so the growing size of government, once you embrace utilitarianism, well, there's no particular end, because all people can think of why it would be good to redistribute somebody else's property in a particular way. And they go, well, this is a good purpose. We need to give more money to that. Well, there's no particular end to that. And so it's denying a fundamental aspect of economics, and that's the notion of economic scarcity. And if you look at the very fact of creation itself, that was God building it into the very, essence of his creation. He created us as finite creatures with a cultural mandate. The cultural mandate was go into all the world and be fruitful and multiply and take dominion. Well, Adam and Eve didn't know everything about how things work. They were going to have to figure it out. And so work and production itself were built into the system. And that meant they were going to have to make choices, how to spend and how to utilize whatever resources they had at hand to accomplish whatever task they thought was most important at the time. That's economics. And so, I think a lot of people think that scarcity is something that occurred after the fall. Well, no, that's not true. It was built into creation itself. What the fall did and what the curse of the ground did meant that this world's not going to treat us very well anymore. There's going to be thorns and thistles, sweat of our brow, all those sorts of things. There's going to be a lot of frustration because creation is going to work against us and not with us. So that's what the fall did, just made it hard.
That's interesting. I like that. And then not too long after Adam and Eve, that laborious requirement to produce, some smart aleck figured out that theft was the first labor-saving device. Huh?
Yeah, it's a sad story of history from that point forward. It's all empire building. This is one of the things that really just occurred to me right off. All empire building. Really what it amounted to was I liken it to mafia gangs, and that utilize their power and weaponry to steal for themselves from their neighbors. And it's really kind of fascinating when you get into it. If you look at, say, the Assyrians, they were of Semitic origin, and they were living in the Mesopotamia River Valley. They were up the Fertile Crescent. And then there were the Sumerians that were living down the Fertile Crescent, closer to the Persian Gulf. And so one of the problems that these agrarian communities had is that robber bands would come out of the mountains at harvest time and begin to, we're going to rape and pillage and plunder you for your produce, because that's how we make our living. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that they had to do is they would have to try to protect themselves and have some, self-defense. Well, it turns out that the Sumerians were actually far better farmers. They developed the best farming techniques and those sorts of things. So they actually ended up being able to produce a lot more agricultural products than the Assyrians. On the other hand, the Assyrians had better military strategies, and so while they didn't produce as much, they kept more of it because they were able to defend themselves better than the Sumerians. Well, eventually it occurred to the Assyrians that, we do have some pretty decent military tactics here. We could just march down the river here and lay siege to the community, and we could make them an offer they can't refuse. And our offer will go like this, for a tribute, we'll make sure bad things don't happen to you. But if you refuse to pay, we can almost guarantee you that bad things will happen to you. And so there you go. There's the way the Assyrian Empire gets started.
I feel like a Samaritan living in an Assyrian Empire.
We all can. And so, the thing is, you got to try to figure out ways to protect yourself from the Assyrians today, right?
Right. That's really the world I live in, trying to, protect myself and
your family and others, your friends. And I mean, that's the thing that... Yeah. Because, you look at these, at the candidates that are running for office, especially on the Democrat side. What a wasteland.
It's almost comical. If it wasn't, well, I guess most comedy is based in tragedy, right? So,
well, yeah. I saw a nice meme on social media about Elizabeth Warren says that only government can be trusted with guns. Yeah. And the follow-up was, you think being an Indian and all, she'd know better than that.
Yeah, I've seen that. We live in Alvarado, Texas, about 20 miles south of Fort Worth, in Johnson County. And so President Trump came into Alvarado, Johnson County, because there's a new Louis Vuitton production facility that's going into operations, or maybe they're already in operations. So it was a big deal. And then he spoke in Dallas. He had a rally at American Airlines. And I'm saying all that to say, I don't watch TV. I try to avoid all the politics. But, since he was driving through your own town, and we're a little old town of 4,000, I wound up watching a good portion of his speech last night, and I'm telling you, it was fun. I was laughing about half the time listening to him. He's hugging on all these Texas Republicans and then kind of slapping them around at the same time and hugging them. And I had fun. I enjoyed listening to him in that speech that he gave yesterday. He's talking about these endless wars, and it was just enjoyable. So, not that I think you necessarily want to listen to a bunch of politicians talk, but I had fun watching or listening to that.
Well, I think he's pretty good at that. As really how he got elected, right? I mean, he appeals to a very broad spectrum, regardless of whether his ideas are right or wrong, right?
All right.
And that's been his success. And yeah, he's gotten a few things. I mean, he's right on target on some things. I mean, you got to admit. And then on other things, you scratch your head and you go, really?
Yeah. Not to be political, but I was just as surprised as probably he was when he got elected. All right. Then, then he goes to Washington, and Henry Kissinger flies in or whatever goes on. I think he was pretty much squared away. We're going to let you do this, but we're still spending $4 trillion on the military-industrial complex. So, and I think that's really more of the same in politics.
They sure don't like him up there. That's for sure. He has shaken things up a good bit, and they're doing everything they can to get him out.
That gives me hope. So he must be doing something, right?
Well, he must be doing. Yeah, I mean that the inside elite doesn't like him at all means that he is challenging their cush little deal, and nothing really wrong with that I can see. But once again, some of the policies that he's pursuing, I would say, the whole tariff stuff, in my mind, it's what, if your end goal is to really create free enterprise, well and good, and get rid of all trade restrictions. Mm-hmm. Well and good. But if you can't achieve that goal this way, you're punishing your own people by doing this. And what's the end? What is it? Can you get there? Can you get people to give up all their trade barriers? Well, if we can, then that's great. But if that doesn't work, then it's going to backfire and be a problem. So on that level, bit a little befuddled. Then he also has made statements about trying to keep, why can't we have negative interest rates like the Europeans? Well, that's insanity. That's just pure insanity. Our Federal Reserve is already out of control on this one, and to go deeper in that hole, that can only blow up in our face, and eventually it's going to, right? All that easy money that they've created out of thin air is a serious problem, and a lot of people don't understand how money works and have bought into that one.
Yeah, I think Jeff Dice wrote an article, Zero Interest Rates, the Destruction of Civilization. Something along those lines. I haven't read it. I've just seen it, but
I'm sorry. I'm just thinking. Historically, short-term rates should be 4 or 5%. That's where short-term rates should be.
That goes all the way back to recorded history.
Sure. That's and because at the end of the day, we do have rates of time preference. Nobody is going to postpone consumption today for the future and not get a rate of return.
Right.
That notion that people have rates of time preference is so fixed in our understanding of things that it's crazy to think that we can just endlessly manipulate the rate to virtual zero, which is what the Fed has been doing for quite a while now.
Yeah, then let's go negative here. I'll pay you $5,000 to hold my $100,000 this year.
Yeah, boy, I tell you, people start putting that money in a jar in their backyard at that point.
I still feel like a Sumerian, in a land of Assyrians,
Yeah. Well, that's one of the nice things about infinite banking is that I don't have to put my money in a jar in the backyard. I can actually get a rate of return on it that makes sense, of the 4 or 5% that makes sense, and I can have access to the dollars as well. Yeah. So,
well, I'm glad you brought that up, because you personally have practiced the infinite banking concept a long time.
I have. Now I was a tough nut to crack, because after all, I had a degree in economics, a PhD, and one of my areas of specialization was finance. And
Well, you had a head start.
Yeah, I remember when Nelson's first trying to explain his infinite banking concept to me, and I'm like, huh? I've always heard you buy a term and you invest the rest. And here I was. I kind of knew, that trying to save and for things that you wanted was a good idea. I knew that. Right. And so I'm trying to do it the old-fashioned way through the market, right? So, I'm trying to get a rate of return through a mutual fund, but I'm getting taxed on the return, and I'm not making any headway whatsoever to be able to outright purchase like an automobile or anything like that. And so now Nelson's like, Paul, I got a better way. And I started looking at it, and I thought, I know Nelson, he's a voracious reader. He understands economics pretty well. And on paper, I look at it, I go, well, yeah, this would work. I mean, it's a long-term strategy, but I kind of like that. He saves a little by a little, makes it grow. And so I kind of got that. And so I just, I stuck my toe in the water. Now, it was hard too at first for me to do so, but I did. And boy, I tell you, that first policy today, man, I've used that so much. Well, that's got me into business. It's got my little business going. And so after a lot of success with that first little policy, I took out a policy on each of my children, who were fairly young at the time I did it, and they weren't big. But even those two policies now have significant cash values to them, and we've been able to use those. I mentioned my son is now teaching high school. Well, we were able to put him through his master's program with policy loans. So, and he's paying it back, and life's good, and he's going to have all that money back, that he'll in the long term. And the other thing is, I remember at the college we had as most colleges experience here and there, when a president comes in who doesn't understand economics and is a communist,
there's a conflict of interest.
they tend to spend money because they don't have a clue, and they nearly bankrupt the institution, which this guy did. And they were, in the midst of total financial crisis at my school at Birmingham Southern. They put a moratorium on committing anything to this retirement plan, and I was like, okay, well, I guess I need to take out another policy. So I cranked up another one, and while everybody else was having difficulties because I'd started the little book business, and I run everything through it, whether it's an honorarium for speaking, whether it's I'm doing some consulting work for a university on curriculum or whatever, or book sales, all that is run through my business, which is, LLC. And so, my business had a great year that year. I ended up buying an automobile, and I took out another policy. So it was all good, life continued on. But my colleagues, now that they're still struggling, they have it, and we're 9 years later now, and they're still struggling. So, go figure.
Well, I like that, when you mentioned the policies on your children, and now they're significant. I mean, whenever you pay premium into policies structured like this, you accumulate a lot more cash value. I understand you see illustrations and you look at numbers on a page, and it makes sense, right? And then when you do it, it doesn't take very long when you look up, and it surprised me. And it surprises a lot of our clients how much cash they actually accumulate.
Oh, yeah. I just started another policy 3 years ago. Well, actually, 2 years ago, I just paid my third premium into it. It's a big one.
Perfect.
I've bitten off a significant chunk because I know how it's going to work. And I know this is going to end up being a game changer. Not just for myself and Kathy, but for our kids. I mean, they're grown now. Caleb is married, and Katie is in a serious relationship with a young man that we really like a lot. And, it's going to end up changing their lives. I mean, they're going to end up in a situation that they'll be financially secure, when a lot of people around us are just not going to be, because it's going to get more and more difficult.
Right. Just protection from the Assyrians. I'm going to use it. I'll reference it.
Protection from the Assyrians. Maybe we need to write a book, James. Sumerians in an Assyrian world.
Right. And how IBC makes sense, whatever.
We could do that.
Yeah. Well, looking back, practicing the infinite banking concept, buying large premium, high cash value life insurance, looking back, knowing what you know and experiencing what you have experienced, would you do anything different?
I would have been more aggressive earlier, to be honest. I would have taken out bigger policies and found a way to pay for them. Looking back on it, if there's anything that I would have done differently, that was it. Because they grow, and they continue to grow, and that rate of growth is, and the freedom it brings, especially when situations come up that are difficult, or when opportunities come up. Mm-hmm. And if I look back, if I had done bigger policies, I think I could have taken advantage of other opportunities that would have generated really free cash flow for me. And those sorts of things are good. Now, most of what I've invested in that's going to generate free cash flow has been my business, right? Which made perfect sense to me. But why not things like real estate or other sorts of things like that? Which if you can get in with a group and buy houses that are in rent, fix them up, rent them out, and begin to generate some free cash flow coming in and pay your policy loans back, it seems like a no-brainer to do things like this. So, and my only problem with doing some of those things is capitalization, mm-hmm. right? So I would just tell people, do what you think, and then probably do a little bit that you think you could do, and then do more. Right. Because you'll be surprised at how well it's going to work, even if it's hard at first, even if it's really difficult at first. Give yourself 10 years, and you're going to start seeing the difference in your situation dramatically improve in that time. I mean, that first policy, and I'll tell you, it was small. I mean, relatively speaking. Sure. But cash value in that thing is over 6 figures.
All right. Did it raise Kathy's eyebrow when you bought the first policy?
Yeah, She was, she was a little concerned, but the more we've used it, the more comfortable she's gotten with it. And,
Sure.
and I tell people the first time I used the policy was the first house that we'd bought in Birmingham. We had the heating and air conditioning system go out in it. So it was going to be about, I think it was around $3,500 was going to be the cost. I mean, I had taken some bids, and we had decided on one that it was going to be $3,500. I had called Nelson because I just had started this policy, and a few years before that, I don't know exactly how long. I think I was about 3 or 4 years into it. And so I called Nelson. I said, Nelson, do I have enough cash value in there to borrow $3,500? And he goes, oh yeah, I'll get him to send you the check. so I remember, doing the deal with the company, and they came in. Of course, there was, well, Mr. Cleveland, how do you want to pay for this? And so I said, well, do you take MasterCard? And they said, well, we can give you a better interest rate than that. I said, no, you don't give me. It was a Shell MasterCard at the time, and I could use $35 worth of gasoline. So, and of course, I was going to pay that. I wasn't paying interest to MasterCard. I was just going to use their money for a while, and which I did. And so the whole thing worked out great. And, I do teach finance, James, so I know how to amortize a loan. and so I kind of said, okay, let me amortize this thing and let me start paying monthly. I'm not going to steal the peas. I know Nelson's taught me that one. So I was writing out the check every month and paying off the loan. Well, I was at the time, I mean, our game plan on buying automobiles at that time was we had the old car, which, by the way, was also my car, and then the wife's car, the new car, right?
All right.
So
that's how that works.
That's how it works. And my game plan was you drive the old car until it don't go anymore,
Right.
So anyway. But I never had enough really capital to buy an automobile outright and have the title from day one. I was always trying to save enough to, get a down payment to make it the loan as small as possible. And so I still owed money on my wife's car and but I was about a year into paying off the loan on the heating and air conditioning system. And I got to thinking about it, and I was like, well, wait a second. I've put enough money back, and I've also paid another premium. I bet I could pay off this bank loan to the car dealership. And I started looking into it, and what do you know, I could. So I borrowed the money back out. I paid the bank off on that car, and I was already used to making both payments, so I just combined the two payments, and now I'm making that payment. Now, I did something that was really dumb next. In hindsight, it was dumb. Eventually, the old car was wearing out, and I needed a new car. So we went and looked around. We found, what we thought would be good, and we made the deal. But I was like $2,500 short of being able to take the policy loan totally out of that to buy that car. And the old car wasn't worth, of course, I didn't get much of anything for it. So I had to borrow that $2,500. I financed that for 2 years. It was the dumb mistake because I was paying off, I took the rest out of a policy loan. So I'm paying off the policy loan, but I'm making these payments to the bank because I did it for 2 years. I should have done it for 7. How many ever years they would have loaned me the money, right, and made bigger payments to the insurance company and smaller payments to the bank, I would have still paid the bank off probably in less than a year, or certainly less than 2 years. But it would have been smart to have done that because I'd have had more cash flow going the other way.
Right.
Things you learn when in the infinite banking world.
How is that for an economic lesson?
Yeah. Anyway.
Right.
But never. Despite little things like this, it just continued to work. From that automobile onward, I've never purchased an automobile with any bank money.
Right.
I've always just borrowed from a policy.
You're a good student.
Yeah, and it's so funny too. You go in the dealership and you finally make the deal, and you're happy with the price and you're happy with the terms, and then you go to the finance office and they go, well, how do you want to pay for this, Mr. Leafland? And I go, well, do you take American Express? Because I have a Delta American Express card and I can use the miles. So, I do it that way. And interesting, they'll put $5,000 on an American Express card. Which is...
surely the F&I guy said, or asked you the question, or told you that they could give you a better rate, right? Well,
actually, a lot of them don't do that. At least one of the dealerships I've been dealing with most doesn't do that. They just kind of ride with it and they go on because I'm writing a check. I think they get it. I'm writing a check for the better part, and they see the card, the card that I'm paying with, and I think they get it right off while I'm doing it that way.
Yeah. So. I remember Nelson used to say, he said it often, that, practicing this concept will cover an awful lot of mistakes.
Oh, it absolutely will. And I've made a number of them over time, and things just don't work out sometimes like you would like, and so but like I said, it continues to grow. And so despite some of the mistakes I've made financially or decisions I've made on certain purchases, it's kind of washed out, and over the long haul we're continuing to make financial progress in our lives, and so that's the key.
Yeah. Well, did the last policy raise Kathy's eyebrows?
Yeah. When I told her how much, she was like, "Well, that's pretty aggressive, isn't it?" I said, "Yeah, but we'll be a whole lot better off in about 7 years if we do this." And she goes, "No, I get it. Let's do it." So she didn't object too much. And I'll tell you, trying to figure out these first 3 premium payments that I've made, they've kind of I had to be kind of creative here a little here and there, and but anyway, it's working out.
Perfect. Well, you've been very gracious with your time, and I don't want to abuse it at all. Anything you'd like to share before we come to an end?
Well, I don't know. If your audience out there is thinking about infinite bank, I would encourage them to look into it. Also, if young millennials who need an education, they need to get off this socialism stuff. And really, I think they've embraced socialism out of more ignorance than anything else. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think their response is they see the kind of rising tide of corporatism in America, and they equate that with being free enterprise or capitalism, and it's not. And so they're rejecting that. Well, I'd reject that too. I mean, I don't see any reason why corporations shouldn't be given any sorts of special privilege of subsidies or whatever. And but that's not free enterprise. Free enterprise is just voluntary exchange between people. And once you get that down, then you can begin to look at the world a little more objectively. So, that's what we're trying to do with our books. And so if you need to try to educate family or friends in that regard, check us out. Go to our website, boundarystone.org, and check out what we have to offer.
Right. No, I agree with that. I encourage everyone listening to go to boundarystone.org for yourself, not only for your friends and your family, but for yourself. The books are incredible. The Basic Economics. I love that. I love all your books. I mean, I haven't read some of the other, but the Great Utopian Delusion, Unmasking the Sacred Lies, Basic Economics. I mean, those really should be required reading for yourself. Okay, well, I appreciate that, Paul, greatly. Well,
thanks for having me on, James. I appreciate spending time with you today.
All right, listen, tell Kathy I said hello. Have a great weekend, and maybe we can do it again.
Absolutely.
All right,
talk to you later.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us on the Banking with Life podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe. Otherwise, find us wherever you get your podcasts and subscribe to join us weekly.